started. How long were you in Atlanta, Sander?
14 years, a
Wow.
long time. We left Chicago, sadly, but it's still my favorite city, and moved about 14 years ago.
And you're originally from New York, aren't you?
I'm originally from Buffalo, which is something nobody admits in public.
I have a couple of very good friends from Buffalo.
As do I, and they never admit it in public.
Okay. Well, your secret is safe with me, Sandra.
And the entire universe.
Let's wait. Let's wait, like, I don't know, 2-3 more minutes, Andreas.
By the way, Sandra, I realized I promised to send you something of mine and I forgot, but I will do so.
I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you for offering to read it. When does your book come out, Sandra?
Just returned the corrected pages. They're aiming 6 weeks, 4 weeks, which shows, by the way, it can be done
Yeah,
if the publisher wants,
that's fast. How long did it take you to write?
I started in March last year. I mean, it was a lockdown project.
Mm.
It was a lockdown.
Do you have a physical copy already, or?
No. I returned the pages. Which
Oh,
are
you returned the page. Yeah.
virtual pages, right? Virtual pages.
Right.
And now it goes, the typesetter puts in all of these virtual corrections,
Right.
and then I get a PDF of the final version, and then they said 4 weeks, 6 weeks. Chicago will have hard copies of the book. Or ebooks. I mean, now, of course, everything is ebook.
Right. Great. Andreas, I guess you want to start?
Should I?
Yeah, I think so. I'm gonna take myself off camera.
Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Andreas Killen. I teach history here at City College, and I help run the Rifkind Center. And before we get started, I and my fellow director, Michal Deckel, would like to extend our thanks to the Winston Foundation for helping sponsor another year of programming here at the Rifkind Center. So today we are thrilled to have with us Dr. Sander Gilman. Over his very long and very illustrious career, Dr. Gilman has worn many hats. Currently, the hats he wears include a position as distinguished professor at Emory University, where he holds positions in the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences and the Department of Psychiatry. He's also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. These titles and honorifics only hint at the incredible breadth and depth of his scholarship. Dr. Gilman is a mind-bogglingly prolific author who has produced over his career 100 and counting books, either authored, singly authored, or edited. Books on topics ranging from Freud to the photographic documentation of the mentally ill. The book on this topic, called Seeing the Insane, is a particular favorite of mine. To subjects like cosmetic surgery and music theory. His newest book, which is titled I Know Who Caused COVID-19, Pandemics and Xenophobia, is now in production with Reaction Press. And it is from that book that Sandra Gilman's talk today is drawn. So the way that this will work is he's gonna share a PowerPoint presentation with us. And at the end of his talk, Michal and I will field questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function for that purpose, okay? And without further ado, I will turn things over to you, Sandra.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you, Michal, and thank all of the colleagues who are here virtually or in reality. I am going to be looking at xenophobia and xenophobia within the ultra-Orthodox communities in New York City. Some of you know that from the 1980s on, I wrote about pandemics and xenophobia. I started with HIV/AIDS. I've written on virtually every pandemic, real or projected, ever since. And I've written in medical journals, and I've written in humanities journals, and I've written in the popular press on this topic. It's a topic that I find important for obvious reasons. And needless to say, being trapped as all of us have been for the last year and change, I was reading the popular press. And one of the things that struck me was a trope. And that trope really interested me. It was the trope that said, don't blame groups for causing a pandemic, in this case, COVID-19, because then you are like the people in the Middle Ages who blamed the Jews for the Black Death, right? In the 13th and 14th centuries. This is from Mark Hay in the Daily Beast in September. They often pile on to establish scapegoats like Jewish populations who have been wrongly blamed for a pandemic since at least the 14th century, Black Death, and falsely accused of manipulating literally every major global event to benefit themselves and others. From India, in August, we have exactly the same thought. The Jews were blamed for incurring God's wrath, thought to be causing the Black Death. In a similar way, certain communities have been blamed for the corona outbreak, both in India and other countries. This is a kind of a trope of false attribution, right? Of false attribution. Now, that is something, of course, that most of us understand. Mary Douglas, in the beginning of HIV/AIDS, a mentor of mine, wrote about the fact that it was maybe a general trait of human society that fear of danger, pandemics, disease, death, tends to strengthen the lines of division in a community. If that is so, the response to a major crisis digs more deeply the cleavages that have been there all the time. This will mean that if there is a big inequity of wealth, the poor will suffer more than if the distribution were more equitable. If there is violent xenophobia, and listen to her language, the foreigners will be more blamed and pogromed more. The Jews reappear in this context as a kind of knee-jerk, false attribution. Now, I understand, right, and I'm not, wrong about this, that when anxiety-provoking realities occur, people blame collectives. And those collectives exist within a common framework in the society, right? And they locate people's inchoate fears. Here is whom I'm going to blame. Mary Douglas is right. Everybody who's been talking about blaming as a bad thing is right. But now I've got a problem, and this is the problem that I address in my book. But what do you do then if the charge is verifiable? How do we deal with the vexing and difficult question of mixing and working through obnoxious stereotyping with actual fact finding. When what is called a category error, this is one of the problems of xenophobia, category error meant by lumping individuals or communities into an overarching constructive classification, whether it's labeled race or class or gender, ethnicity, turns out to be wrong in the generalization, but correct in the particular case. When the hoary claim that stereotypes contain a kernel of truth suddenly seems to be right. How can we examine causation along with the analysis of stigma without falling into the trap of seeing all categories as constructed? And by that, when we say constructed with that, those scare quotes, we really mean made up, fictive. And so what I want to stress is that even though in public health, we talk about populations, populations are not communities, and communities are not populations. Communities are bound by symbolic registers. My old colleague, the late Ben Anderson, thought about this aloud in his great book, Imagined Communities in the 1980s. He said that communities arise when the national state becomes so large and so diffuse that a symbolic register, the flag, the leader, language, race, or indeed health and illness come to be the focus of the newly constituted symbolic community. Anderson's, however, clear that he's not just writing about the constitution of post-Enlightenment nation states. What he's talking about is the complexity of creating nation states out of symbols. So Enlightenment thinkers such as Heredia, in his Ideas toward a Philosophy of the History of Mankind, denied there could be, for example, a state made out of multiple languages and multiple cultures. He hated Switzerland, by the way. But what he is talking about is a state which incorporated various levels of what? Symbolic vocabularies, enabling for a citizen to shift symbolic codes. And the problem is, and this is a real problem which Anderson did not address, what happens when a person belongs to multiple communities with multiple contradictory symbolic codes, right? And what results, of course, is a double bind, and that double bind demands explanation. And I'm going to be talking about that. Now, Freud picks this up in 1921 in his very famous paper on mass psychology, answering the British who accused the Germans and Austrians in World War I of basically sharing a paranoia. And he writes, and this is a quote that I use all the time, "We are no longer astonished," this is 1921, "that greater differences, not similarities, should lead to an almost insuperable repugnance," talking about the perception of differences, "such as the Gallic people feel for the German, the Aryan for the Semite, and the white races for the colored. These have to do with symbolic registers that not only define that which is different, but also which is coherent and that which one belongs to." Now, Anderson talks about this arising in the Enlightenment, and I would agree. And since we're going to be addressing here one set of communities, right, Ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities, one has to say the Enlightenment doesn't like to deal with individuals. It doesn't like to do with collectives, with communities, because of this conflicting symbolic codes. And though thus during the French Revolution, or after the French Revolution, the Code de Clermont-Tonnerre in 1789 noted that a Jew could have all the civil rights they wanted, but the Jews, and this is a really important phrase because it's what binds Anderson's notion of nation state to the symbolic communities that I'm talking about. But none of these civil rights could be granted to a nation. That's the problem of secularization in contemporary France. Modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox thinkers rebelled against these forms of identification that vitiated community boundaries, that said you could only have one set of codes. They said, we have a set of codes, we don't want to give them up. Now, the chapter that I do, which is very complicated, I'm giving you a kind of a summary, deals with three sets of I'm going to use the term Heredia and ultra-Orthodox as interchangeable. They are not, I will explain that. In the United States, in Great Britain, and Israel. And today I'm only talking about the United States, and to be brutal about it, I'm only talking about New York City and New York State. Now, one of the things I want to start out with is a kind of a statement of fact. Ultra-Orthodox Heredia communities had substantially higher COVID rates, substantially higher rates of hospitalization, substantially higher rates of death than other self-defined communities, and indeed as the population as a whole in the US, Great Britain, and Israel. As many as a third of people in these communities tested positive. And in March, one member of the community noted that not a single Hasidic family in New York City had been untouched. And they said, this is a plague on a biblical scale. But at exactly the same moment, Yossi Gestiner, who is a co-founder of the Orthodox Jewish Public Affairs Council, noted, people in the rest of the country, remember this started out as an urban, blue, and I'm going to add Jewish plague. People in the rest of the country are blaming New York for the nationwide problem. So then people in New York are trying to blame somebody else. This is a problem that we're going to see, which is not only being blamed, but then identifying the people you blame. But those who don't understand that went out of their way to stalk, harass, and discriminate against members of the community. Stalk, harass, and discriminate. These are going to be complicated categories. Now, there was an attempt then to talk about why these communities had this explosive rate. And I'm going to go through these explanations, and I'll do it fairly quickly. The first one is homogeneity. And I started by saying, I'm going to use these labels. Ultra-Orthodox, let me use the label Heredia. This is a serious lumping, right? There are, groups ranging from radical anti-Zionist and isolationist ultra-Orthodox to the major Hasidic rabbinic courts, from the Ger, which is the largest community in Israel, to the Zatmar and the Bobover in New York City. These have a rabbinic leadership. There's the Lubavitchers, which many of you know under Chabad, which I'm going to make an argument, quoting Menachem Friedman and Samuel Heilman, that they're actually closer to so-called Messianic Jews, right? Christians who call themselves Jews, because they are waiting for the second coming of their rabbi, right? Of Schneerson. Each one of these groups as an entity, as a community, responded to COVID in oftentimes antithetical ways. Some of them advocated masking, distributed masks. Some of them refused to stop having religious services. Some of them hid religious services. Some of them had mass events. Some of them advocated for vaccination. There is no homogeneity, right? There is no homogeneity. In spite of that, they have a third number of cases higher. Shaul Magid at Dartmouth, who came out of a Heredia community, says, and he's not wrong, that the Heredia community just has different social structures. The Heredia community, he wrote to me, is a much more social community that most of us live in, By social, I mean that the collective life is driven by social events, from as small as a daily minyan, night seder, to as big as a Hasidic wedding or the Rebbe's table on Sukkot. These events don't have the same values in our world as in theirs, but they have the same equilibrium. Those of you who know the TV series Orthodox, but the number of people leaving the Heredia community in the last year since COVID has tripled, maybe even quadrupled. So the notion that it's coherent in its social ramifications, true, but also not true. It's Greenberg, the man who created the City College Jewish Studies program, and an outspoken opponent to Orthodox Jewish, ultra-Orthodox Jewish leadership in Israel and in New York, wrote that by and large, the religious leadership has been a drag on the efforts to contain the pandemic. Where it does not outright encourage policies that increase transmission, it has often posed obstacles to needed actions. Rabbis, both Haredi, Ultra-Orthodox, and Haldal, National Haredi, and this is in Israel, but it's true in New York too, insisted that the yeshivot learning Torah should go on, and even though they were spreading the virus. True, absolutely true, but also, of course, community leaders and rabbis were ambivalent. Some of them want masking, some of them don't want masking, some of them want distancing, some of them don't want distancing. And of course, since December, some of them have been advocating, in fact, most of them have been advocating for vaccination. One explanation, which has been very powerful, is that ultra-Orthodox Jews are very poor in the United States. And this is an analogy which is used to the African-American community. Why does the African-American community have such high rates? It is said it's because they are poor, they live in proximity, they have jobs which bring necessary jobs which they cannot abandon because they are necessary in society, but yet they're very low-paying jobs. Now, the reality in the United States is that, the Haredim actually had, at least in 2013, the figures have changed, but not radically, higher incomes than conservative Jews and much higher incomes than the general public. By the way, in Israel, it's very different. They have much lower rates of income than the general public. But in Israel, they do not perceive themselves as poor. We have wonderful attitude surveys. They don't have lots of money, but very few of them talk about poverty, and virtually none of them talk about food insufficiency. Why? Because there is, in addition to income, both in the United States, in Israel, and in Great Britain, collective structures. Jews are like Mormons, right? The communities take care. Now, the one that seems to have the biggest resonance is not, right, homogeneity of structure, not homogeneity of social group and practice, not homogeneity of leadership, not homogeneity of economic inequality, but rather they're picking on us, right? Yossi Gessner says it's about disparities, institutional racism, and poverty, which is fine because the idea to take people who are victimized of a problem and make it about them is unheard of bigotry. He's talking about African Americans, but what he's doing is saying that we, or ultra-Orthodox Jews, we Haredi, have exactly the same problem. A problem of faulty analogy, but a powerful one in the age of what? Black Lives Matter. Maybe now black hats matter. Now, we really have to understand that communities, the Haredi communities, use symbols that are group specific but readable in the general society. Black hats. These symbolic orders always are within the group, but they resonate but not beyond the group. They seem to be limited to the group, but they place the group always in the context of the symbolic register of the greater society. And one of the things that is permeates, I'm going to say since the Enlightenment, we could argue since Thucydides blamed the Ethiopians for the Athenian plague, is that health and illness becomes a way of talking about blame and constituting the symbolic register of the community. We are inherently healthy. If we are sick, it's got to come from someplace else. Now, one of the things we have to understand is, I'm saying symbolic registers, you are thinking Levi-Strauss, but you know, in the Orthodox community, we have real symbols. We have the eruv, and the eruv, for those of you who don't know, is this symbolic but concrete wire object, is twine, that defines the border of a community so that one can carry objects, a stroller, a cane, on days in which one is not permitted to do so, on Shabbos, on the high holidays, and so forth and so on. And as many of you know, some of the most interesting conflicts in the United States and in Britain, not in Israel, but it's in Britain too, is between Jewish communities on Long Island, communities therefore that are secular but have a heavy Jewish population, which begin to be aware of the presence of ever greater numbers of ultra-Orthodox Jews when they demand having an eruv. Now, eruvs are invisible. They're not real in the sense of tangible, but they are real in the sense of being tangible, okay? So we've got real symbolic registers. Now, masks, as all of you have figured out, right? Masks are both symbolic and concrete. And this is in the Orthodox community, burning masks as there's an attempt to limit the spread within the ultra-Orthodox communities. Now, what interests me is how this then becomes theology. There's a big debate about whether Jews can have a theology. I tend to believe they don't. They have rules to live by, but they do not have an overarching theological structure analogous to Christianity. Christianity's theologies. Gilad Yabni, who's a dentist, I call her a maskless dentist. Those of you who are old enough remember when dentists were accused of having spread and being the victim of HIV/AIDS, and we had a requirement that all dentists mask. I call her my maskless dentist. Writes in June of 2020, however, this virus, when it came down to battling an unseen enemy, wouldn't the more intuitive approach to let God handle this war without our help? We couldn't even see the enemy this time. Wouldn't it have been smarter to step aside and say, God, this battle is all you. We can't even see what we are fighting. Let's step back and let you handle it. Trust does not look down on an entire world walking around in masks and say, good job. This is the weirdest notion now of, again, a symbolic register, again, of what? Certainly not the Jewish community, right? I mean, on Purim, one wears masks, right? There's nothing, Jews don't have problems with masks, right? This is Trump. This is the right-wing ideological statement about freedom. It's license, not freedom. This is clashing symbolic registers made uniform. And needless to say, on January the 6th, 2021, guess who is at the US Capitol? We are shocked. Our friend Gilad Yabvi is there. Heshi Tischler, as many of you know, has been one of the leaders. He's a radio shock jock, an ultra-Orthodox shock jock. He was running for city council. He appears in a lot of these attempts of the city in New York to deal with the spread of the community, wearing a Trump for President button before the election, probably still wearing it, and who yells at the city public health people that you are Nazis. Now we're going to get symbolic registers. Who gets blamed? It's in point of fact authority. Wait a minute, we just said authority. Trump is our ally. This is now the interesting conflict, right? Who is the Nazis, right? The fake press. They're Nazis, they're traitors, they're Moisa, and they're accusing the people covering events as being part of this Nazi conspiracy to kill Jews while Jews are actively dying of the pandemic. Trump becomes, in this complicated way, by the way, from March on in the Ultra-Orthodox community, which had voted heavily, 80 to 90% for Trump, the new Messiah. I mean, if Schneerson hasn't shown up yet, we'll use Trump as a substitute. And of course, those of you who know that in these crowds are ultra-Orthodox Jews with payas at the Capitol, and people wearing Camp Auschwitz outfits, Israeli flags, right, and flags of the Confederacy. By the way, the Confederacy representing now not the secessionist states, but the Jim Crow South with the Klan targeting Jews, Catholics, and African Americans. Right? This has got to be one of the weirdest images I have ever seen in my life. Rothschild is part of the QAnon conspiracy, the American flag, the Trump flag, and the Israeli flag. Tischler, by the way, organizes buses to Washington for this event. He wants to be in the Capitol. He said, if I were actually in front, his grammar is worse than mine, I wouldn't have stormed, I would have walked into the doors, walked into my Capitol, right? Now, one of the things I've noted is that Trump has become freedom to, these are Isaiah Berlin's categories, right? Freedom to act rather than Berlin's freedom from what? Freedom from death by the pandemic. And Trump has played all of the cards. I'm going to ignore Israel for a second, a complicated question. But he plays all of the cards for the ultra-Orthodox community, for conservative Catholics, and for evangelicals. He's for freedom of religion. Yeah, but whose religion, right? And he's for funding religious institutions. He comes to represent anti-authoritarianism, anti-science, anti-state control. He's president of the United States. He becomes the anti-Nazi. And the Supreme Court, in a whole series of findings since the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, have found that this notion of religious freedom, which is religious license, right, trumps everything else. A word, by the way, trumps, which has not gotten unusable, overrides everything else. In other words, it's perfectly okay to have religious activities that kill people if you argue that inhibiting this defines freedom of religion. By the way, freedom of religion has never been so defined. Freedom of religion has never been so defined constitutionally. Why am I saying that? Because the Constitution for Dummies that the writers of the American Constitution read was Blackstone's commentary on British law. It is the core of American common law. It is the core of the Constitution, right? They don't know much. They've all read Blackstone, right? And Blackstone says in times of plague, he's a Hobbesian. The state has the obligation to punish people who violate quarantine, who violate curfew. They should be whipped as vagabonds, right? And what he says, and this is very Hobbesian, this is freedom from. He says personal security, core of the Declaration of Independence, core of the Constitution, right? Guarantees uninterrupted enjoyment of life, limbs, body, and health. And by the way, the whole history of constitutional findings on quarantine and pandemics, here I'm quoting from a 1902 case, simply echoes this. What has happened to the Supreme Court since Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death has nothing to do with the basic symbolic register of constitutional law, which says no, freedom of religion does not override the common good. Now, this is a problem which is really important. This is the problem of conflicting symbolic regimes and picking winners. One of the things that we have to say is that in Israel, the critique has been one which we knew very well. Gilad Malach, who runs a think tank studying these communities, have called them a state within a state in Israel, right? And he says that half of the Sikha Haredim, it affects the whole country. But it's that phrase, a state within a state, that brings us back, of course, to Ben Anderson, brings us back to the constitution of communities with symbolic registers. And who is the great spokesman of this in our lifetime? Not your lifetimes, you're all 40 years and younger, but in my lifetime, a woman whom I respected as a thinker, not so great as a person. And that was, of course, Hannah Arendt, who writes, of course, in her trilogy on totalitarianism, that one of the things that the Enlightenment had to do was to overcome this notion of the Jews being a state within a state, a nation within the nation. By the way, it's not just the Jews in the German-speaking lands, right? There's a whole group of people who have who are subsumed, right? The Slavic speakers in Prussia, who are subsumed now to this new symbolic register. And what she said, of course, is rather true, which is that many Jews, not all of them, had no political ambitions of their own, right, in the constitution of the modern state, and were merely the only social group that was unconditionally loyal to the state. They were half right, because the Jews, taken as a social and not as a political body, actually did form a separate group, a nation within the nation, because they had a separate symbolic register, which is why Reformed Jewry begins to change the symbolic register of Jews in the German-speaking world, right? This is Locke, right? I've become a Hobbesian as opposed to a Lockean, because Locke wants to distinguish the business of civil government from that of religion, right? He says government can't control souls, but it controls bodies. So in that sense, he's a Hobbesian, but he would probably come down on the side of religious freedom. By the way, not for atheists. He wasn't like crazy, right? But one of the things we have to understand when we talk about Haredi, about ultra-Orthodox communities, is that all religions, every religion, always claims to be immutable, unchanging since the founding moment, right? Moses on the mountain. Sorry. Yeah, my phone is going off. Welcome to Zoom. It will stop in a moment. It does. Okay. Well, the Germans understand that that religions are mutable, German Jews, that religion is mutable, certainly for a number of Jewish communities, mainly in Eastern Europe, but certainly also in the German-speaking lands, they begin to see their codes as under attack. This is true with the extension of Jewish enlightenment into Tsarist Russia, and is the reason, by the way, that so few Jews become Russified, because the state doesn't let them and they don't have the option. The state, however, is never neutral. It always demands primary allegiance to its symbolic register. Jonathan Jacobs noted that many Jews in secular states may not accept the responsibility to fulfill their commandments, right? But still identify strongly as Jews, people of a community committed, he says, to democratic, I would say, secular values. Now, there are interesting moments in the German-speaking world, one that I know well. And that's, of course, the creation of modern Orthodoxy, not Ultra-Orthodoxy, not the Haredim, but modern Orthodoxy, and mainly through the work of Samuel Raphael Hirsch. Hirsch says we've got to have our own code. We have to study Torah in the secular world. But he has an interesting commentary, and I want to stress this. He says, yeah, but Jewish laws are rather interesting. They only apply to the Jews. And then he looks, because he's in the first age of an understanding of germ theory transmission of disease. He says, when we look at diseases that the Bible talks about, like leprosy, Hansen's disease, those rules have nothing to do with public health. They have nothing to do with the state and with the nation. They have only to do with the Jews. Because the law says that all of these laws about defilement and exile and who can go to the temple and who can make sacrifices, whether they have leprosy or not, only applies to the Jews in the communities, not to the non-Jews living with them. He splits with this notion. He's both recognizes modern science and recognizes that the symbolic register of religion has nothing to do with that, right? And this is one of the big problems that we have reading back into Torah, the notion, for example, the Jews knew about trichinosis and didn't eat pork. This is what we call a materialist fantasy of disease. By the way, it's no big surprise that his granddaughter became one of the first women physicians, never mind one of the first Jewish women physicians in the German-speaking world. Okay, we have a double bind. We know that Bateson says that the result is confusion when you've got, these conflicting symbolic registers that you're in. And this is the problem that I want to end with. The symbolic register in the ultra-Orthodox communities in New York, in Israel, and in New York have conflicting symbolic registers within each community. And that's why some of them go one way in one moment and the other in another. That is, they're coherent, but they're incoherent. They're coherent also in the greater society. They love the anti-vaxxers. They hate the anti-vaxxers, right? Because that symbolic register begins to be expressed in the notion that health and illness, this dichotomy that defines a community, the healthy community, and the idea that these are religious communities and that the freedom of the religious community means that it cannot be bound by the laws of secular society unless they wish to be bound by the laws of secular society. Trump, then, Donald J. Trump, former president of the United States, becomes then what we used to call in the good old days of rhetorical analysis, a free-floating signifier. He is everything to every people. You want to wear a mask, he wears a mask. You don't want to wear a mask, he doesn't want to wear a mask. You want vaccination, that's fine. You want no vaccination, that's fine too. He becomes an anchor for what are basically conflicting ideas of adequate understanding of self within the Orthodox communities. But who is the victim? I'm being blamed, they say. Right? I am the target of blame. I become symbolic in the greater society for people who are putting the society at risk. My people are dying at greater rates than they are. But they're blaming me, even though my action actually is causing this. This is a real problem. So whom do I blame? I now, as the person who has this incoherent, inchoate symbolic registry, I have to go into the instrumentalization of history. That's really important because, by the way, that happens in the African American society with Tuskegee. It happens in the Chinese society because after Wuhan, who gets blamed? Initially, the Black communities in Wuhan and in the other large urban areas. Who do I blame? Well, I blame the Nazis. Is Trump a Nazi? No, but de Blasio is a Nazi. De Blasio, by the way, was the biggest supporter of the Orthodox community when it came to the public health question of the spread of herpes. He overrides the changes that Bloomberg had made in public health reporting because he had advocated and represented the ultra-Orthodox communities when it came to the problems, the public health problems of circumcision. Is this contradictory? It is inherently contradictory. That's where the problem lies. So the Heredia community, the Ultra-Orthodox communities, are simultaneously insiders and outsiders. They explain, right, their problem as a problem of being blamed while acknowledging that their actions are causing that blame to be leveled at them. But anybody who blames them is by definition an anti-Semite. And if you're an anti-Semite, you're a Nazi. I'm going to end on a rather upsetting note about the instrumentalization of history. As you know, the American right wing has spread globally. You see marches in London, you see marches in Melbourne, you see marches in Berlin of these weird conglomerations in Paris of anti-vaxxers and anti-statists and neo-Nazis and fascists. In Berlin, the fascist party, the neo-Nazi party, and by the way, I say that with a certain degree of accuracy, which is called the Alternative for Germany, handed out yellow stars, right? Yellow stars like the Nazis made the Jews. First of all, in the government of Poland, gouvernement of Poland, and then in Germany. And instead of saying Jude, Jew, it says ungeimpft, unvaccinated. These are the people who are Holocaust deniers. These are the people who identify with Holocaust victims. Same problem, same problem. I thank you for your attention. I say Hashem Dank, and I will note that every academic lecture is an ad for something. It is an ad today for my book called I Know Who Caused COVID-19, Pandemics and Xenophobia, forthcoming in London by my regular press, Reaction Press, distributed in the United States by the University of Chicago Press. If all goes well, it will be available, I used to say, before the end of the pandemic. Let us hope by the summer of 2021. I think we're going to be living with this for a good deal. So I thank you very much. I'm happy to open now for queries.
Thank you very much for that bracing talk, Sander, and for helping us try to think through some of these difficult issues. So yeah, we can open the floor to questions. Please post your questions on the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to collect them and to relay them on to Sander. I want to start by going back to the image you showed us of the march on the Capitol on January 6th. In particular, that photograph, the photograph you showed us where American flags, QAnon flags, Trump flags, and other flags appear alongside Israeli flags, and then the guy with the Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt. I have to confess, I was unaware of the presence of Israeli flags in that gathering. It somehow escaped my attention, and I guess there may be no way of explaining this, but I just wonder, are the people carrying those Israeli flags, are they aware of the strange juxtaposition that is created by carrying such flags alongside people who are sporting sweatshirts that say Camp Auschwitz? I mean, how do they deal with that?
Or QAnon. I mean, QAnon is rabidly anti-Semitic.
Right.
Let me just say, this is why when I first worked on this, I thought to myself, well, this is an enormous Venn diagram. You put it in your head, a Venn diagram. And the overlapping is Trump, right? In other words, not Trump as a person, he doesn't interest me, but Trump as a highly mobile symbol. But the reality is, each one of these people brought to the demonstration in Washington their own symbolic register, right? Trump, in a sense, in that symbolic register, has different meanings, right? Trump is a complicated image. Trump is, in point of fact, the equivalent to an empty sign, right? He sold himself over and over again through advertising. And advertising, is not about content, right? It's about image. And so ultra-Orthodox Jews, who, by the way, many of whom now have been indicted, many of them should be indicted because they arranged for transportation. The only ones who've been indicted are the ones who were actually in the Capitol. And the one who was most obvious was a guy wearing a bear vest, right? Not the guy with horns, but wearing a bear vest, who stole a shield from one of the cops. His father runs one of the big ultra-Orthodox organizations that has been the strongest anti-masking, anti-vaccination group in New York City. So the answer is, it's not inchoate. It makes perfectly good sense unless you try to understand the totality. And the totality has to do with the fact that all of them try to understand themselves as having common purpose within this secular world. That's what's so weird about the Heredia communities. If you wanted to make an argument for me, which is one that I've heard over and over again, is that Trump was good for Israel and Trump therefore stands for a kind of pro-Israel stance. But that isn't what they're talking about. They're talking about vaccination, they're talking about masking, they're talking about distancing, they're talking about massive weddings and funerals, right? Israel is number 17 on this list. I don't understand it any more than you do. I just try to explain it.
Okay. So we can start going to some of the questions in the Q&A function. One member of the audience writes that Jews are supposed to hold health as the highest value, and says, as such, I don't understand why all community leaders didn't immediately endorse masks and distancing and vaccines, despite the fact that the state advocates them.
This is one of these problems about the notion of a Jewish theology. Reformed Jews have fallen into a Christian model, which is that what do Jews want to do? They want to do tikkun olam. They want to reconstitute and improve the world. That's a theological statement. One of the cool things about Judaism as a set of religious practices and beliefs is that it is inherently contradictory. That's what the Talmud is about, right? The Talmud is a set of contradictory interpretations of the law. That's why there can't be a Jewish theology. Theology, in a sense, is a blanket which explains everything. So yeah, it's true. Talmud talks on one level about preserving life. The Talmud also has a debate about abortion and comes down pretty much on the side that abortion should be permitted, right? The Greeks didn't like the Jews for that reason, right? So the answer is yes, if you believe in a theological model of Judaism, there are all of these things which are prohibited and things. If you believe that Judaism is a set of ever-evolving and ever-competing worlds within the Jewish world in responding to the world beyond the Jews. By the way, historically, that's always been the case. The Jews have always responded to outside, Rabbinic Judaism, obviously, to the Greco-Roman world, right? But even when there is the kingdoms of Judea and of Israel, they're responding to the greater world. So this notion that you can define the Jews as being advocates for life beyond everything else, yeah, in some cases it is, and in some cases it isn't. Judaisms, plural, are interesting because they're living.
Okay, Michal?
Oh, Sandra, thank you. This was great, and I think a much needed unpacking of the situation. I have, I don't know, some thoughts on me, and then the question. First of all, I wanted to ask you about the difference between Israel, what happened in Israel and what happened here during the pandemic. And I'm saying that as somebody who lives in both places in a sense. And one of the things that seems to have been exposed was that there was always an assumption, at least among my circles, that the situation, that the kind of rift between the state and the Ultra-Orthodox community is much worse in Israel than in America. Than in America, there was more negotiation, let's say, or compliance. And what has been exposed is actually that the situation was pretty similar. I believe. I don't know if you think otherwise. And so that's one question. And then secondly, I do think whether, especially given your presentation, whether we have to think about these communities and maybe in general about political affiliations in a new way than just thinking about left and right. Because the Ultra-Orthodox communities are exactly the example of that kind of contradiction. For example, in Israel, they are on the one hand, of course, affiliated with the right, and they're all Likud voters on Balk and so on. On the other hand, they are kind of strange allies of the anti-Zionist left in this, because they're anti-Zionist, because they, in some ways, they in the very fringes, they even support sort of anti-Zionist and Holocaust denying conferences in Iran. And so they end up very right on some issues, but in a way very left on ultra left on some other issues. And I'm wondering how if we can just find new terms to think about the situation.
Let me just say that one of the most striking things about the differences between Israel and the United States and Britain, by the way, it's a real triangle because people are moving constantly among the three sets of communities, is the fact that until the third lockdown in Israel, the official, and remember in Israel, we have parties representing Orthodox communities, both Ashkenazi and obviously also Sephardim communities, which you don't have in the United States. We actually have parties. They basically adhered to the argument that the public good trumps everything. They weren't happy about it, but they agreed. The third lockdown, they came out against the public health laws. And everybody that I read in Israel and everybody I spoke to in Israel said, this is the first time in the history of Israel that the ultra-Orthodox parties basically took positions against the laws. So the answer is, yeah, up to September, October, it was fragmented and everything else. But after the government, Netanyahu government, first of all, tried to create a coherent policy, which was undermined, as you know, when they tried to, for example, close down religious establishments. There was a real kind of a sense that the regime, the Netanyahu regime, in which the parties of the religious parties are represented, became suddenly Nazis. They literally were called Nazis. And Litzman, who was Minister of Health, who is ultra-Orthodox himself, was called a Nazi, this instrumentalization of history. So the answer is absolutely. The situation in Israel is different, but it also has to do with the power of these conflicting symbolic regimens within the community and without. And by the way, I have never found left and right good concepts in dealing with politics. I wrote 40 years ago a book about degeneration theory, in which I pointed out that both the Communist Party and the Nazi Party believed in degeneration theory, and that the Soviet Union was set up to overcome degeneration, right? And the Nazis it was set up after 1935, the Nuremberg laws, to overcome degeneration, right? There was no different left and right when it came to notions of social degeneration, religious degeneration, biological degeneration. So you're right, in Israel and in the United States, it's weird. Let me just give you one example, which interests me a lot. I got interested in these conflicting symbolic regimens. So one of the first things that Trump does when he becomes president is that he invites the most outspoken anti-vaccination spokesman to meet him way before the inauguration. And that's young Kennedy. Kennedy comes and meets with Trump, leaves Trump Towers and says, Trump is going to set up a committee. I'm going to run it about vaccination. Never happens, by the way. Kennedy is simultaneously one of the leaders of the global environmental movement, left and right. Everything that Trump does in the environment he detests. Everything that he does that is anti-status vis-a-vis COVID, he applauds.
Okay, another question from an audience member who would like to ask you to please talk to ask you to talk about how evangelical Christians fit into your picture, the relationship or the friendship, he says, seems one that is fraught with contradictions.
Friendship between Jews and evangelical, Ultra-Orthodox Jews
Yeah.
and evangelical. Again, up to a year and a half ago, I would have made an argument, which is a complicated argument, that evangelicals have been using American Jewish right-wing thought for their own ends. You know the argument, which is that this is, by the way, this has nothing to do with the long history of Protestantism. This is the late 19th century offshoot of American Protestant thought, which talks about the rapture and the second coming and the great struggle in which the Jews are either converted or going to die, and the state of Israel is a necessary. I mean, you know the argument. I don't want to go into the argument. In other words, it would have been a standard Christian evangelical presence in Israel, which has, by the way, been the case since the foundation of the state. Well, it's been the case in Israel since the late 19th century, never mind the founding of the state of Israel. And what happens is that this kind of odd overlapping of the politics of Zionism with the politics of transcendental politics of American evangelical thought, which, by the way, is now global, but it starts out in the United States, was a kind of a necessary political friendship. You know, we tolerated, you know, we let them build a new college. So something radically happens with COVID. It really radically happens. Because what happens is that political identification, the movement of the embassy and the right wing in Israel, and you know, bringing in weird people from the evangelical right for political activities, right? Something very weird happens. That falls down the list of things that are important. What becomes vitally important, right, is the notion that social controls necessary for public health are, in point of fact, an impingement of the state on religious communities. The evangelicals argue this, the Ultra-Orthodox Jews argue this simultaneously. But the odd thing in Israel is that we, of course, have had 40 years of evangelical proselytization in Israel. Not religious proselytization. Again, this comes to the fore, but medical proselytization. So, for example, one of the things that the Jewish debates always argue is about the necessary preserving life, what a healthy body is, what a coherent life is, and so forth and so on. And it's always contrasted with other systems that exist simultaneously. American evangelicals persuade Israeli thinkers that their notion of the coherence of the body as something God-given, not contested, but God-given and absolute, becomes something that ultra-Orthodox thinkers in Israel and evangelical thinkers in the United States suddenly can latch onto. And what does the right wing, what does Trump, free-floating signifier Trump, advocate for? What? A coherent notion of health in the body. Absolutely coherent. No debates when life begins, no debates about end of life, none of these questions that have to do with health interventions. All of that is coherent because the notion of the body is rigid and unchanging. Real easy then to talk about anti-vaccination, anti-masking, religious freedom, right? Mary Baker Eddy, founder of Christian Science, doesn't believe in allopathic medicine, the beginning gets all kinds of shit from the medical establishment. Finally is drawn into court over what? A measles epidemic. And she says, our belief deals with individuals. It doesn't deal with community infectious diseases. The state trumps even the belief of people who don't believe in allopathic medicine, like the Christian Scientists, at least at the very beginning, right? When it comes to the public's health. Why? Because it doesn't stay within the individual, right? Mary Baker and Eddy and Hirsch and all these people understand that you can set all the symbolic boundaries you want. Bacteria, viruses, fungi don't respect boundaries.
Okay. Here is another question that relates, I think, to the question that Michal posed a moment ago. The audience member refers to an article that appeared in, I think it appeared in Israel. It's called "Exile Within Sovereignty," and it was written by someone named Amon Raz Karkochkin. And in this article, the author argues that the Haredi state within a state was sort of seen as or kind of promoted as an inoculation against nationalism, and goes on to say that this alliance between Haredi and Trump forces us to rethink this.
You know, in Israel, I mean, again, this is not true in the United States. In the United States, it's real easy. The Ultra-Orthodox community in New York State votes overwhelmingly for the Republicans, and not just Trump. I mean, there's straight ticket Republicans, right? It's like being in Kansas. And one of the things that one has to say is that Israel, these communities have a very ambivalent relationship to nationalism. They have parties in the Knesset, right? In the parliament. People stand for these parties. They represent the communities in the national state, see themselves as of the national state, partially because the national state has carved out certain things for which these parties have advocated. At the beginning of the state, for example, control over conversion and civil ceremony, and what would be civil ceremonies in a secular society. We always talk about marriage, but burial is more important. Burial is more important. But also about service in the armed forces, right? The armed forces are the social motor for social integration, are the motor for social integration in the Israeli state. It's where new immigrants, for example, learn Hebrew. It's where all of the people from the various social and economic levels come together, men and women, right? And are forced to deal with one another in peculiar circumstances. Serving in the army is always peculiar circumstances, because there is a symbolic register which expresses values in the army, right? You'll have to salute a superior officer, that kind of stuff. So the Orthodox communities are both highly political, highly engaged, highly nationalistic. And there are, of course, these groups that are anti-Zionist and are still waiting for the Messiah to come. But they're a relatively small group, and they're not represented in the parties. Parties like Shas, for example, are nationalistic parties in that sense. They identify with and function within the national state, as long as the national state has carved out for them exceptions. And so one of the interesting problems in I think the second election, they've all become one election in the last 2 years for me, was that one of the right-wing nationalist parties, which is anti-exceptionalist, right, which wants the ultra-Orthodox Jewish men, at least, I would say people, but men at least, to serve in the armed forces, wound up not wanting to function in a government with the religious parties. So the answer is really interesting to me. Are these nations within nations? No, because every symbolic regimen that I've described is ambiguous and malleable and always in discussion with other ones. This notion somehow or another that religion has these big walls around it fascinates me, because of course that is part of the ideology of all religions. We were here at the beginning, we are unchanging, we are authentic. I always point out, and let me just end this tirade on this, is that the three great leaders of the three directions of Judaism, Moses Mendelssohn, right? The Vilna Gaon, modern Orthodox, and the founders of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, are contemporaries. So every strand of Judaism we have today is an Enlightenment strand. It's an 18th century strand, right? No religious belief system within Judaism today goes back prior to those moments. Why? Because they're all defining one another, right? Before that, we have an amorphous mess. Thank you.
Can we maybe shift the focus slightly to talk about other ways in which xenophobia has entered the public sphere in relationship to the pandemic? I'm interested, obviously, in particular, in the Trump's messaging about the China virus. Is that something that one finds evidence of elsewhere outside the United States to the same degree? In Israel, for instance?
Again, one of the things one has to say it, one has to say it loudly, is we live in an America-centric world. One of the things that I found very weird observing excuse me, demonstrations in Germany is that the signs are in English. That is the anti-Chinese argument, which morphs very quickly into an anti-Asian argument. Remember, there's an issue of Life magazine in 1942 with a big chart. How do you tell our allies, the Chinese, from our enemy, the Japanese, right? The answer is the anti-Chinese, anti-Asian is ubiquitous, true in, very early on in April. 1st April, not the 2nd April. In Paris, someone spray paints COVID-19 and anti-Chinese slogans all over my favorite Japanese restaurant in the Marais. When my friends in Paris told me that, I laughed. I thought how stupid people are, because at that point it was still anti-Chinese. And then I realized, of course, this is xenophobia. These are these symbolic registers are very malleable. And you've seen this in this country. It's the Koreans, it's the Thais, it's anybody who looks Asian, by the way, which is a rather complicated category. because of course, not only does it cover huge numbers of Asian Americans, right? But I will point out to you, because I love talking about this, is that American Jews have one of the highest rates of interracial marriages in the United States. But what is their rate of intermarriage with? Asians. So Jewish kids with an Asian parent wind up being part of the anti-Chinese target. So it is important. And by the way, this is not trivial shit. One of the things about talking about xenophobia is I talk about it as symbolic registers, as images, but we're talking about concrete people. This always comes down to the way we treat individuals. We saw that at the Capitol. These were people who were flying the blue flag matters, right? The blue line, all lives matter. The cops are good guys, and they're beating the shit out, killing cops. So when we talk about xenophobia, and that's why I wrote this book, is that it has to do with the treatment not only of symbolic communities, but of human beings. And that's where it gets really important. And in the United States, one of the things that I think one has to understand is that it all becomes overlapped. So QAnon doesn't like the Jews. The Jews manipulate the African Americans. The Jews are causing social unrest. The social unrest reveals itself through the state controls of COVID. Who's responsible for that? Who? The Rothschilds, who funded now what? Right? What? A Sputnik with a laser. Now, that's funny until somebody gets killed over it.
Yeah. So maybe one last question. Again, this is from the Q&A sender. I think perhaps in response to the note of pessimism in your talk, the question is simply, what can we do?
Well, one of the reasons I began working on this in the 1960s, right, was that I was involved in the civil rights movement. I was thrown out of SNCC, was one of the white guys thrown out of SNCC in the 60s. Because I thought I was going to change hearts and minds, right? I realized I can't change hearts and minds. I can change actions in the world. So what I want to come out of my work in COVID is an understanding that I don't care what you believe. I really don't give a flying fig about what you believe. But I want you to understand that your actions, your fist has got to stay away from my nose, especially my masked nose. We are in a moment where your insecurities, your fears, your disagreements are impacting on me. Christ said, Hillel said, Confucius said, act as if all of your acts, Kant said, affect everybody all the time. That's what I want. And I want to be honest with you, a society which understands that. Because, I joked at the beginning or the end that my book will be out at the end of the pandemic. We're going to have a fourth spike. And we're going to have a fourth spike because of the mutations that are being caused because people are not taking simple, easily taken interventions. So what do I want? I want the federal government to mandate a whole bunch of actions. I'm not a pessimist, right? Because I saw what happened when the federal government mandated school integration, mandated housing integration. People didn't like it. People rebelled against it. But the state said it had to happen. Whatever you liked was unimportant. You had to act according to the common good. End of sermon.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think that we will wrap things up. Sandra, thank you so much for speaking to us today and for sharing your thoughts on this extraordinarily
Thank you both for your hospitality, and thank the listeners for paying attention.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I guess, Michal, do you want to keep this open for a little bit to speak with Sandra, or should we just?
Yeah, maybe a little bit if you don't mind. And just thank you everybody for coming. As usual, follow us on rifkindcenter.org, sorry, and come to our next events. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
And I'll be in touch soon, Sandra, okay?
I'd be delighted.
Okay.
I'm not going anyplace.
All right. Thanks so much again. Bye-bye.
Sandra, do you want to stay on for a second, for a couple
Sure,
minutes?
sure.
So I just wanted to say hi and thanks. And I mean, this was really interesting. I actually just came back from Israel.
Pardon me,
sorry.
you're gonna have to we have to end the meeting, and so you'll have to end it and restart another meeting because they have another, just because of the way it's set up through the webinar. I'm very sorry.
Okay, Sandra, so we'll be in touch. And then,
No problem, love. Keep well.
Yes, sir.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.